In 1953, two scientists stood before the world and announced one of the most important discoveries in human history. They revealed the double helix structure of DNA, the molecule that contains the instructions for all life on Earth. James Watson and Francis Crick became instant celebrities, their names carved into every biology textbook ever written, and 4 years later, they would share a Nobel Prize for their groundbreaking work. But here's what they didn't tell anyone that day. Their entire discovery was built on stolen data. They had looked at photographs they were never supposed to see, used calculations from research that didn't belong to them, and constructed their famous model from someone else's unpublished work. The real breakthrough wasn't theirs at all. It belonged to a woman whose name they barely mentioned, a brilliant scientist who had spent years perfecting techniques that no one else could master, who had captured the single most important image in the history of molecular biology, and who would die without ever knowing that her work had been taken from her. Her name was Rosalind Franklin, and for decades, the scientific establishment worked to erase her from one of science's greatest stories. This isn't just about one woman being denied credit. This is about how an entire system conspired to steal genius, how reputations were destroyed to justify theft, and how the truth stayed buried for over 40 years. What you're about to hear is the true story of DNA's discovery, and I promise you, it's nothing like what you learned in school. Rosalind Franklin was born in 1920 into a world that had very specific ideas about what women were supposed to do with their lives. She came from a wealthy Jewish family in London, the kind of family where daughters were raised to be charming, elegant, and focused on one goal above all others: finding a good husband. Science wasn't just discouraged for women, it was considered fundamentally inappropriate, almost unnatural. But from the time she was a child, Rosalind was different. She wasn't interested in being decorative or playing the social games that her world expected. She wanted to understand how things actually worked. She approached the world with a precision and logic that would later define her entire career, asking questions that made adults uncomfortable and refusing to accept simple answers. When she was just 15 years old, she made an announcement that sent shockwaves through her family. She told her father that she intended to become a scientist. The argument that followed was explosive. Her father wasn't just skeptical, he was adamantly opposed. He genuinely believed that women's minds weren't built for scientific thinking, that pursuing such an unsuitable career would ruin any chance she had for a respectable life. But Rosalind's brilliance couldn't be denied. She fought her way into Cambridge University at a time when women were barely tolerated in academia. She studied chemistry at Newnham College with an intensity that impressed even the professors who thought women didn't belong there. And in 1941, right in the middle of World War II, she graduated with a degree in chemistry. While her male classmates were being fast-tracked into prestigious military research positions, Rosalind found herself analyzing coal. It wasn't glamorous work. Understanding the microstructure of coal for the British war effort was important, yes, but it was far from the cutting-edge science her male peers were doing. Still, she made it matter. Her doctoral research on coal became groundbreaking work that established her as a meticulous, innovative researcher who could extract meaning from the most mundane materials. By 1946, she had published multiple important papers on carbon compounds. She was proving, slowly but surely, that women could excel at the highest levels of research science. But she was proving it in an environment that remained fundamentally hostile to the very idea that she belonged there. And then, France made her an offer she couldn't refuse. From 1947 to 1950, Rosalind worked in Paris, and these 3 years would become some of her happiest of her scientific career. For the first time in her life, she experienced something that had been completely absent in England: respect. Under the mentorship of Jacques Morin at the Laboratoire Central des Services Chimiques, Rosalind mastered X-ray crystallography. This wasn't simple photography. This was one of the most complex techniques in all of science, requiring deep knowledge of physics, mathematics, and chemistry all at once. The process involved passing X-rays through crystallized substances and analyzing the diffraction patterns that emerged. Most researchers couldn't interpret these patterns at all. Rosalind became one of the world's best. But what made Paris special wasn't just the scientific training, although that was invaluable. What made Paris special was the experience of being treated like a real scientist rather than an intruder. Her French colleagues valued her intellect, engaged seriously with her ideas, and treated her as an equal. They didn't question whether a woman belonged in the laboratory. They simply accepted her competence and moved forward. For perhaps the first time in her life, Rosalind experienced something approaching a meritocracy. This brief taste of what scientific work could be like when gender barriers were lowered would make what came next even more painful. In 1951, she returned to England to take a position at King's College London. She had been assigned to work on DNA, the mysterious molecule that everyone believed held the secret of heredity. This should have been the opportunity that established her as one of the leading scientists of her generation. Instead, it became a nightmare that would ultimately rob her of credit for one of science's greatest discoveries. From her very first day at King's College, Rosalind faced obstacles that had nothing to do with science. While male scientists gathered in the faculty lounge to eat, exchange ideas, and build the professional networks that would advance their careers, Rosalind was banned from entering. Women simply weren't allowed. This wasn't a minor inconvenience. The faculty lounge was where the real work of science happened. Casual conversations turned into collaborations. Informal mentorship relationships formed. Crucial information was shared. And Rosalind was permanently excluded from all of it, simply because of her gender. But the most damaging aspect of her experience at King's was her relationship with Maurice Wilkins. Wilkins had completely misunderstood her position. He thought she'd been hired as his assistant, a subordinate who would work under his direction. He had no idea that she was actually an independent researcher with her own projects and her own authority. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. It reflected the rigid gender hierarchy of the era, where women in scientific settings were automatically assumed to be in subordinate positions, regardless of their actual qualifications. When Rosalind spoke about her work with the same confidence and authority that male scientists routinely displayed, Wilkins interpreted it as hostility. When she defended her interpretations and challenged his assumptions, he saw her as difficult rather than rigorous. He began describing her to other scientists as hostile and difficult, labels that were reflexively applied to any woman who refused to soften her expertise or defer to male colleagues. These characterizations would later prove very convenient when the theft of her work needed to be justified. Despite this toxic environment, or perhaps because of it, Rosalind threw herself into her work with extraordinary intensity. She refined X-ray crystallography techniques to unprecedented levels of precision, developing methods that allowed her to capture increasingly clear images of DNA structure. Her methodical approach revealed something crucial that other researchers had missed. DNA existed in two different forms, a dry A form and a wet B form that had a helical structure. This discovery was critical because it meant researchers needed to be extremely careful under which conditions they studied DNA. Then, in May 1952, Rosalind captured an image that would change everything. Photograph 51 was an X-ray diffraction image that showed a distinct X-shaped pattern. To anyone with expertise in crystallography, this image was unmistakable. It was definitive proof that DNA had a helical structure, captured with a clarity that no previous image had achieved. This wasn't luck.
This wasn't an accident. This photograph represented the culmination of months of meticulous work, countless refinements to her technique, and a deep understanding of how to interpret diffraction patterns. Looking at photograph 51, you could see everything. The angles, the spacing, the intensity of the pattern all pointed to one conclusion. DNA was a helix, and Rosalind Franklin had captured the proof. She began the careful process of analyzing what the photograph revealed, taking precise measurements that would allow her to determine the exact parameters of DNA structure. She was preparing to publish her findings in carefully documented papers that would establish her priority in discovering DNA's helical form. She had no way of knowing that her breakthrough was about to be stolen. What happened next represents one of the most flagrant acts of intellectual theft in the history of science. Without Rosalind's knowledge or consent, Maurice Wilkins took photograph 51 and showed it to James Watson, who was working with Francis Crick at Cambridge on their own attempts to determine DNA structure.
Watson immediately recognized what he was seeing. The photograph wasn't ambiguous or unclear. It was definitive evidence of a helical structure, the exact proof that he and Crick had been desperately seeking for months. They had been constructing theoretical models and making educated guesses, but they had lacked concrete evidence to confirm anything. Rosalind's photograph gave them exactly what they needed, but they gained access to more than just the photograph. Through channels that Rosalind knew nothing about, Watson and Crick also obtained her unpublished research data from a Medical Research Council report. This report contained her precise measurements of DNA's structural parameters, the dimensions, angles, and spacing that defined the molecule's architecture. This was detailed, unpublished data that represented months of careful experimental work. Armed with Rosalind's stolen intellectual property, both her breakthrough photograph and her precise calculations, Watson and Crick rapidly constructed their famous DNA model. They didn't have to spend months conducting experiments or capturing their own X-ray photographs. They didn't have to develop their own techniques for analyzing diffraction patterns. They simply took Rosalind's work and used it to build the model that would make them famous. When Watson and Crick published their famous paper in Nature in 1953, announcing the double helix structure that would revolutionize biology, they credited themselves with the discovery. Rosalind's contribution was reduced to a vague acknowledgement of stimulating discussions and unpublished results they had been informed of. This carefully neutral language completely obscured the reality that they had used her specific data without her knowledge or permission. The double helix they unveiled wasn't just influenced by Rosalind's work. It was directly dependent on data she had meticulously gathered but not yet published. The sugar-phosphate backbone on the outside of the helix, the specific helical parameters, the spacing between nucleotide pairs, all of these features came from Rosalind's measurements and observations. This deliberate minimization of her role began a systematic erasure that would continue for decades. The scientific community, already primed to attribute major discoveries to men, readily accepted the narrative that Watson and Crick alone had uncovered life's fundamental code through their own brilliance. When Rosalind discovered that her unpublished data had been used without her consent, she found herself in an impossible position. Speaking out would mark her as difficult and uncollegial. Pursuing any formal complaint would likely destroy her career and accomplish nothing. She chose to focus on her own work rather than fighting a battle she couldn't win. Shortly after the DNA controversy, Rosalind left King's College for Birkbeck College, where she produced groundbreaking research on virus structure. Over 5 years, she published 17 papers that advanced the field dramatically. She proved to be an
excellent mentor, and colleagues described her as brilliant, rigorous, and supportive. But even as her career flourished, her time was running out. She was diagnosed with ovarian cancer and continued working until she was physically unable. In April 1958, at 37, Rosalind Franklin died. 4 years later, Watson, Crick, and Wilkins received the Nobel Prize. The committee's rules prohibit posthumous awards, automatically excluding Rosalind. Even in their acceptance speeches, the three men failed to properly acknowledge her critical role. In 1968, James Watson published The Double Helix, portraying Rosalind as virtually villainous, an unfeminine woman who couldn't interpret her own data and stubbornly hindered progress. He described her appearance in unflattering terms, questioned her competence, and suggested she didn't understand her own work. This character assassination served a strategic purpose. By portraying Rosalind as incompetent and difficult, Watson implied that using her data without credit was justified. The attacks were fundamentally gendered, focusing on her appearance and personality rather than addressing the ethics of appropriating her work. But Watson's portrayal bore little resemblance to reality. Her notebooks reveal extraordinary precision and insight. Scientists who worked with her describe someone completely different, a brilliant, generous colleague. Only in recent decades has Rosalind Franklin begun receiving proper recognition. Modern textbooks acknowledge that the discovery was made possible by her photographic evidence and measurements. Universities have established awards in her name. Her story is told as an example of both scientific excellence and historical injustice. But here's what we need to understand. Rosalind Franklin didn't just contribute to one of science's greatest discoveries, she made it possible. Her work was the foundation, her photograph was the proof, her measurements were the dimensions. Every advance in molecular biology, every breakthrough in genetic medicine traces back to the discovery of DNA structure, a discovery impossible without her. James Watson and Francis Crick won the Nobel Prize for discovering DNA structure using stolen data. These are facts that history has finally acknowledged, even if the official record can never be changed. Every time you see a DNA double helix model, every time you read about genetic research, you're seeing the legacy of Rosalind Franklin's work. She deserved to share the recognition. She deserved to see her contributions acknowledged while alive. She deserved to be remembered as one of the brilliant minds who uncovered life's secret. Today, when we wear shirts with her name, establish awards in her honor, and tell her story to inspire new generations of women in science, we're not just celebrating her achievements. We're acknowledging a historical injustice and committing to ensure that future generations receive the recognition Rosalind Franklin was denied. Her name should be spoken in the same breath as Watson and Crick, because without Rosalind Franklin, there would be no double helix, there would be no molecular biology revolution, there would be no genetic medicine. There would only be two men with theories they couldn't prove, staring at data they didn't have, trying to solve a puzzle that required the genius they would eventually steal. Remember her name. Remember what was taken from her, and remember that behind every great man of science, there might be a brilliant woman whose work was stolen and whose name was erased. This is the story they didn't want you to know, but now you do.
If this story made you angry, if it inspired you, if it made you wonder who else has been erased, then you need to subscribe to this channel right now.
Because if we don't tell these stories, who will? And if we don't remember these women, who else gets forgotten tomorrow?
They can steal credit, they can rewrite papers, they can dominate textbooks, but they can't stop us from finding the truth and sharing it.
That's why you need to subscribe to Women Erased. Let's rewrite history together.